Hi everyone, this is Mr. Seymour, and today we're going to look at the first of our river valley civilizations, the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, or Mesopotamia. Your objectives for today are that at the end of this lesson, you will be able to identify the major causes and describe the major effects of the events from 8000 BC to 500 BC. The development of the river valley civilizations. You'll summarize the impact of the development of farming, the Neolithic Revolution, on the creation of river valley civilizations, and you'll be able to identify the characteristics of a civilization. All of these we've already done, but we're going to look at them in respect for Mesopotamia. We're going to describe major political, religious, philosophical, and cultural influences of Persia, India, China, Israel, Greece, Rome, and the developments of monotheism in Judaism and Christianity, all of which are responsibility of or were impacted by Mesopotamia. Now, Mesopotamia literally means in Greek, the land between two rivers. It's the oldest known occurrence of the name that dates back to 4th century BC, when it was used to designate the land east of the Euphrates River in northern Syria. And later it was more generally applied to all of the lands between the Euphrates River, which is on this side, the Euphrates, and the Tigris River on this side, which incorporates not only parts of Syria, but it also incorporates most of Iraq, southeastern Turkey, and the neighboring steppes of Asia. This is in Western Asia. It starts as part of the Zagros Mountains to the north, and it goes down all the way to the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea in the south and the west. We call this the birthplace of civilization. Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, cradle of civilization. Throughout the centuries, historians have used all of these powerful words to describe the Middle East. In the ancient Middle East, many great civilizations would rise and fall. For instance, the religions of Judaism and Christianity and Islam all trace their roots back to this area of the world. And all of these civilizations would arise in the area known as the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent will stretch from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the Zagros Mountains in the east and the north, and it's bordered in the north by the Taros Mountains and in the south by the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Desert. Its shape, though, resembles a crescent, as we saw in a previous lesson. And one area within the Fertile Crescent that gave rise to the region's most powerful empires and grandest cities was Mesopotamia, which is the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, and really we call it the cradle of civilization. Mankind starts in Africa, but he moves in a south and westward way into Southwest Asia. All right, so here's the Taurus Mountains to the north, with Turkey. And your Zagros Mountains are here to the east, which would be separating Iraq and Iran. And Mesopotamia is this area here, starting in the Mediterranean, moving all the way over to the Persian Gulf. Here's Israel right down here along, and Lebanon. Syria is here. Modern day Iraq is here. Most of what we know as Mesopotamia is right in this part of Iraq. Here's Baghdad right here. It's in that part of Iraq between the Euphrates on this side and the Tigris River on this side. That's the Tigris. There's the Euphrates. And there's modern day Iraq.
In Sumer, part of the ancient land of Mesopotamia, there was a famous city-state called Nippur. One day, a teacher in Nippur asked his students to start a journal about their lives and their country. This is the story of one student, Nisaba, and her journal.
Okay, here we go. Nisaba's journal, entry 1. Teacher wants us to write about our lives. What is my life like here in Sumer? I think I'll tell the story of my people from the very beginning. My grandfather knows all about it. He says the first thing we Sumerians did was get really good at farming. My ancestors used to make their living by hunting wild animals for food. They were constantly on the move, following the herds. As they traveled, they would also gather wild berries, nuts, and greens to eat. But they often didn't know where their next meal would come from. It was a hard way to live. Then they discovered they could plant and harvest a kind of wheat they found growing wild. And they also found out how to tame wild goats and sheep and raise them for food. Grandfather calls that domestication. It meant they didn't have to hunt for food anymore. They could grow it themselves. And so my ancestors stopped wandering and stayed here. They discovered that food grows better here than almost anywhere else. That's because we're in a river valley, right between two rivers, in fact. Mesopotamia actually means land between the rivers. One river is the Tigris, and the other is the Euphrates. My grandfather says it's easy to grow food in our valley because the soil here is so fertile. And he says that is because of the mountains up north. It snows a lot up there in the winter. When the snow melts, all that water runs down into the valley and into the rivers. Then the rivers rise over their banks and flood the valley. And they dump a lot of really good dirt on the land. It's great for growing food in. So now we eat really well. We grow barley and wheat, lots of beans and fresh vegetables, and fruits like melons, dates, apples, figs, and grapes. Our animals give us milk, cheese, and meat, and there are always plenty of fish in the rivers. When my ancestors first started farming here, their biggest problem was never knowing when a flood might come and wash away their crops. Crops survived that. They might die in the summer when it's so hot and there's not enough water. But my people didn't give up. Instead, we actually invented a way to control the river. First, we learned how to build levees. Those are big piles of earth between the fields and the river. They're too tall for the river to get over, so they prevent the floods. Then we made gated ditches around the fields, and when the crops needed water in the summer, we would just open the gates and let some river water flow in. To plant our crops, we use a great tool called a plow. It's a Sumerian invention, and we use an ox to pull the plow, another of our great ideas. Some of our smartest people invented a calendar based on the moon and stars. My grandfather says nobody had ever thought of a way to measure time like that before. It helps us know when the floods will come. In our calendar, each year has 12 months, and each month has 30 days. Each month is represented by one of the constellations in the sky. They're called the zodiac. Our priests watch the zodiac to know which month it is. That way, they know when the floods from the mountains will arrive. We Sumerians also invented writing. My grandfather says that in the old days, nobody knew how to write. Well, if you can't write, how do you keep track of how many animals you sold last month? What are you supposed to do, paint them on cave walls? No, we're much more modern here in Sumer. we figured out how to write on clay tablets. You just take a piece of reed and cut a stylus from it. That's a sort of hard pointed tool. You press the point into some wet clay, and pretty soon you're writing. Our style of writing is called Cuneiform. With writing, you can keep records of everything you do. It's great because then you don't have to remember it all. You also can make things permanent when you write them down. For example, we were the first people to write down our laws. But this is maybe the best thing we invented, the wheel. You'd think somebody back in the old days would have thought of it sooner, but we were the first. Before carts and wheels, we used to just drag things around. That was hard. But like I said, we are very modern here in Sumer. My grandfather says that in the old days, most everybody had to work at farming the land. But not anymore. We Sumerians got so good at growing food, some people could quit farming and let others grow enough for everybody. Of course, you had to be neighbors for that to work. So people settled down close to each other in villages. And the villages grew into city-states. Each city-state has its own king, and each one is sacred to one of the gods. My city-state is called Nippur. It's on the banks of the Euphrates River, and it's the most holy city in all of Sumer. Nippur is sacred to the god Enlil, our greatest god. His temple, the ziggurat, is right in the middle of the city. Our ziggurat is named Eduranki, which means the house binding heaven and earth. The ziggurat is a huge square building, sort of like a pyramid. It's made of several layers, or stories. As you go higher up, each story is smaller than the one below. The very top story is the temple, where the god lives. Around the ziggurat are houses where the wealthy people live, like priests and merchants, for instance. They live in two-story houses. Further away from the temple are one-story houses where shopkeepers and craftspeople live. And beyond them live the farmers and fishermen. All the land outside the city belongs to the city-state too, but most people live inside the city walls. We are very good at making bricks out of mud. That's a good thing because there's a lot of mud here. We gather a bunch of mud, pat it into square molds, and bake the mud bricks in the sun until they're dry. We use them to make all of our buildings. Here's my house. My family lives in one of the two-story houses close to the ziggurat. That's because my dad works for the king. My mom runs the house. Our slaves do the actual work, but my mom supervises them. They prepare meals, keep the house clean, and do other household chores. Mother also weaves beautiful cloth to make clothing. Her cloth is made of fine wool from our own sheep. She sells a lot of it to the traders' caravans. My younger sisters help my mom spin yarn and weave cloth. But I begged my dad to send me to tablet school. I'm learning to write so I can be a scribe. It's a really important job. There are a lot of other jobs in Sumer, like being a potter or a fisherman. Some people grind grain into flour and brew beer. Some are traders, and some just play music. Hey, that wouldn't be so bad. But it would be bad to be a slave. Some slaves were captured in war, and others became slaves because they owed money. They have to work for 3 years, often in the grain fields, and then they are set free. Besides the king and his family, the people with the highest positions are the priests. They care for the gods and make sure they're happy. That reminds me, I should write something about our religion. It plays a big part in our lives. We believe in 7 great gods of the earth, sky, sun, moon, salt water, fresh water, and wind. My city, Nippur, is protected by the god Enlil, the god of wind. We believe he lives in his temple on top of the ziggurat. We spend a lot of time praying to our gods. A lot of people even make a little statue of themselves praying and leave it in the temple. The statues keep on praying while the people go about their daily chores. Our priests hold ceremonies to honor the gods and offer them food twice each day. My older brother Shulgi is a priest in the ziggurat. Only priests are allowed inside. Shulgi reminds me of that every chance he gets. Gods own the land and everything on it. So we give the gods everything we grow. Then the priests share it with all the people. They make sure everyone gets enough. Each city-state in Sumer has a king called an Ensi. We believe he was chosen by the gods to rule us, and that it was the gods who gave us our laws. Our king makes judgments when people have arguments. He's in charge of all our trade with other cities. He decides who gets to farm our fields. And he makes sure the gods' temples are in good repair and that all the right offerings are made. He's got a whole lot to do. So obviously, he needs other people to help him do it. My dad is one of them, and of course my brother helps because he's a priest. Maybe I'll work there too when I'm older. Scribes keep records on clay tablets of everything that happens each year. The king and the priests all work in the ziggurat. It's full of offices and workrooms and storage spaces. To support the king and the priests, our people pay taxes throughout the year. Usually, it's something like a couple of sheep or bags of grain. But there are taxes on almost everything. We get taxed on the livestock we own and on the fish we catch. We even get taxed on our funerals. In our city, every man who is head of a household has to pay a tax called the burden. It's not the usual kind of tax. It's time, not goods. The men have to spend time working for the government, doing things that help or protect the city. For example, my uncle helped to harvest the barley crop. Other men have to go dig out the irrigation ditches to keep them clear. Our neighbor sent one of his slaves to do his work. My dad says you're not supposed to, but people do it if they can afford it. All the taxes go to the king. They pay for our army, which is pretty expensive, and also for repairs and improvements to our city. Grandfather always says, there are priests and there are kings, but the tax man is the one you should be afraid of. Well, that's my journal entry for today. I think it's a pretty good picture of who we Sumerians are and how we live.
Now, when cultures move from place to place and influence other cultures, that's called cultural diffusion. And when a culture borrows from another culture, that's called cultural assimilation. So you need to know those two terms, cultural diffusion, cultural assimilation. The Fertile Crescent is this region where humans first began to farm and herd around 8000 BCE. And this dramatic change, which is caused by a shift from nomadic hunting and gathering into the development of sedentary permanent villages and the beginning of the accumulation of food surpluses. And remember, food surpluses lead to trade, which will lead to centers of trade, which will lead to cities. Trade, that's your key word here. So food surpluses lead to trade. When a surplus occurs, early villagers would begin to focus on developing the skills that are associated with a civilization. And some of them would become priests, scribes, merchants, and artists, and teachers, and government officials. We call these specialized workers. They will begin to build cities, which are centers of trade. Before long, they're building empires. And the first of these empires are the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, and the Phoenicians. Will all build great empires along the Mediterranean, and they will establish what we know as the cultures of the Middle East. Because they're all constantly interacting with each other through war and trade, the societies in the Middle East will borrow. So when the culture moves from one place to another, that's called cultural diffusion. When one culture borrows from another culture, that's called cultural assimilation. And often these changes are great improvements. You don't want to borrow what somebody else has messed up. You want to borrow what they do well. Over time, many aspects of various societies throughout the Middle East will start to resemble each other. And so you start to have a shared culture. A shared culture. A way of life. Now, the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, is also known as a crossroads to culture, society, trade, and faith. The Middle East is also the crossroads of the ancient world. It's located at the merging points of three continents. The three continents that come together are Europe, Africa, and Asia. It's mostly Southwest Asia, but part of it is in Europe and part of it is in Africa. Many travelers who journeyed from one continent to the next would pass through the Middle East, and they would absorb that culture, and that would introduce new ideas to the region. So throughout the many centuries, this was a prized location, but it's also a source of conflict, and its goods would become a source of envy. And one other thing, this place is out in the open. So in order to protect itself, each city-state would have to build walls around their city, and then at the center of the city would always be a religious center and a government center and a center of trade. It shared all of those features. This thing right here called a ziggurat. So the ideas that would come out of the Middle East would make it a source of faith, the center of religious faith, the center of the three greatest religions in the world. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all center in the same place. And they share similar features in terms of geography and culture. So the center of religious faith, society, and government was this large stone complex that was called a ziggurat. This is a ziggurat right here, a ziggurat. Now, Sumerians were the first firmly established culture in Mesopotamia by the middle of the 4th millennium, 4,000 years BCE, in the archaeological Uruk period, the city of Uruk, which is the oldest city that we know of here. Although scholars dispute when they arrived, it's hard to tell where the Sumerians might have come from because the Sumerian language can't be fully translated and is unrelated to any other known language that we can translate. Their mythology includes many references to the area of Mesopotamia, but there aren't much clues as to where in Mesopotamia they originated from. So the summation is that we think that they traveled from Africa, somewhere in Africa, into this area that we know as Mesopotamia. And we also think that they had been there for quite a while, at least 4,000 years before Christ. By the 3rd millennium, 3,000 years BCE, these urban people, they lived in large cities. They had urban centers, and they developed into increasingly complex societies. And things like irrigation, where you're taking water to the crops, and other means of exploiting food sources were being used to amass large surpluses of food. Just the fact that they invent the wheel is important. Huge building projects were being undertaken by rulers, and political organization is going to become even more sophisticated. So you have an increasing level of sophistication, which leads to even more civilization. Throughout this 1,000-year millennium that happens about the 3rd millennium BC, the various city-states of Kish, Uruk, Ur, and Lagash will fight each other for power, and they will gain power. Hegemony is control over each other at various times. There's also Nippur and Gursu, who are important religious centers. And Eridu is also a religious center. And this is also the time of a guy named Gilgamesh. And he's a semi-historical king in Uruk and the subject of the famous epic of Gilgamesh. And by 2600 BCE, this becomes the first decipherable and understanding form of writing, of literature, which is written on something called Cuneiform, or syllabic script. So this form of writing was written down on clay tablets using something called a stylus. They would take a reed from the river, and they would sharpen it, and they would use it to make symbols. It's a symbolic language.
It is referred to as the Kushim clay tablet, and it is believed to have been made around 2600 BC. This tablet shows the details of the transaction of grains. The upper part means 135,000 liters. This is the item in question, barley. They drew it as it is. The left side represents the terms of the transaction. It says 37 months. This tablet is a record that somebody lent or borrowed 135,000 liters of barley for a period of 37 months. What then do these symbols mean? According to research, the sound represented by these symbols is Kushim. Unlike the other symbols found on these ancient relics, the meaning of these are a mystery.
The two signs in these early tablets, Kushim, are puzzling because they don't mean anything. The two signs individually each have a meaning, but together they don't seem to mean anything. And so it's been suggested, quite plausibly, that this is somebody's name, that somebody wrote these two signs because the names sounded the same way. A Ku sign, meaning something, and a Shim sign, meaning something else, but together, just somebody's name.
The phonetic symbols Ku and Shim came together to form Kushim, a symbol that represents a sound. This marked the beginning of syllabic writing. It was the birth of rebus writing system. A single example of a rebus can be found using a car and a cat. This representation, however, does not mean a car and a cat. The sounds of the words represented by these pictographs, car and pet, could be used to mean something completely different. In this case, carpet. These symbols, meaningless by themselves, come together to form a word. This type of writing system is known as a rebus, a representation of words in the form of pictures or symbols. In the modern era, this concept is seen as quite simple and basic, but for people in ancient times, the adoption of a rebus writing system was a truly revolutionary development. With the adoption of more complex rebuses, the number of cuneiforms shrank from about 1,500 to about 600. The previously complicated pictures became simpler. More advanced forms of cuneiform were found in relics north of Ur.
So why are written records so important? Well, thousands of these tablets, cuneiform tablets, have been unearthed, And some libraries have even been discovered with over 10,000 of them, and they are preserved in the desert of Mesopotamia today. Although the majority of these contain records of trade, things like I traded 2 cows for 2 pigs, and the distribution by governments of things like grain, and trade transactions, some contain literature, myths, stories, and letters. And these documents have provided us with a great deal of information about the culture. So this is truly the first recorded history. With their ingenuity, the Sumerian people would develop complex systems of irrigation where you're taking the water to the crops. Written language, which would be Cuneiform. They also were the first people to use the plow to lift the silt soil from their crop fields. They invent the sailboat. They're the first to design the calendar based on the phases of the moon. They develop a numerical system based on the number 60. They also used to measure seconds and minutes, which is why we have 60 seconds and 60 minutes. Gilgamesh is actually the king of Uruk in Babylonia in 2700 BCE. And he's the subject of really the first recorded piece of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Sumerians would record their stories and myths about Gilgamesh, and they wrote them on those clay tablets, and they were combined into what we know as an epic. Now, the versions of this tale are translated into other languages, including Akkadian, which is spoken by Babylonians. The first surviving version is derived from 12 stone tablets in the Akkadian language, which were found stored in a library in Nineveh back in the 1930s. So let's look at the Epic of Gilgamesh. This epic relates to the heroic deeds of a king called Gilgamesh, who is the king of Uruk. His father is mortal, his mother is a goddess. And since Gilgamesh is part mortal, he knows that he's going to die one day. But he longs for immortality, whether through doing great deeds or discovering the secret to eternal life. So he roams the earth on his quest, and he meets Utnapishtim, the only human granted eternal life by the gods. He tells Gilgamesh many stories, including one of a great flood that covers the earth. Sound familiar? What happened to Gilgamesh? Well, let's find out. This is an excerpt from Gilgamesh right here. This is an excerpt. It says, O man of Shurpak, son of Ubuturu, tear down the house and build a boat. Abandon your wealth. Seek living beings. Spurn possessions. Keep alive all the living beings. Make all the living beings go into the boat that you are to build. Its dimensions must be measured equal to each other. Its length must correspond to its width. Its roof over like the Apsu from Tablet 11, translated by Marian Kovacs 1998. Now, does this sound familiar? Because it sure sounds like the story of Noah to me. It sounds an awful lot like the story of Noah. So this is a culture of many firsts. The Sumerians would lead the way for each other and the societies that followed them. Now, the next thing we need to understand is Babylonia and Hammurabi. Hammurabi is the best known and most celebrated of all the Mesopotamian kings. He ruled the empire from 1792 to 1750 BCE, but he was concerned with keeping law and order in his kingdom. And this was not his only reason for compiling it, but he compiles a list of laws. So when he begins ruling the city-state of Babylon, he had control of nobody. He didn't really control more than 50 square miles of territory. but he conquered other city-states. Now, when you start building territory and conquering other city-states, you're building an empire. So he builds an empire. And he sees the need to unify the groups who had different ways of behaving. So he sees a need for a code of justice, laws. So Hammurabi understood that to achieve his goal, he needed one universal set of laws for all of the diverse peoples he conquered. So he is credited with creating a universal set of laws or establishing a rule of law. So he sends his legal experts throughout his kingdom to gather existing laws, and then he puts them all together. He reviews them, and he keeps about 282 of them. Despite what many people believe, this is not the first code of laws. There's an older code of laws that we find in the city of Ebla, and this is Tel Mardik in Syria. And they date to 2400 BCE, so about 700, 600 years or so before Hammurabi. But Hammurabi is certainly the most famous. The Code of Hammurabi is the longest surviving text from Old Babylon period. The code has been seen as an early example of a fundamental law that regulates government and the whole need for law. So it's like a primitive constitution, but on this one, it's based on harsh punishment for bad behavior. The code is one of the earliest examples of the idea of presumption of innocence. It's also suggesting that the accused and the accuser have the opportunity to provide evidence. The occasional nature of many of the provisions of it suggests that the code can be maybe better understood as a codification of his decisions, the decisions he made as king, and that by memorizing his wisdom and justice, its purpose may have been self-glorification for Hammurabi. But no matter what, it's used as a model of legal and judicial reasoning, and we're going to see it modeled again as the laws of Moses, Mosaic law, get created for the Israelites. Now Hammurabi is supposed to be the king of righteousness, on whose Shamash has confirmed the law. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So if you poke my eye, I poke your eye. If you poke out my tooth, I take your tooth. This phrase, along with the idea of written laws, goes back to ancient Mesopotamian culture. It will be adopted in the Bible. It will be adopted in other civilizations such as the Greeks and the Romans. Eye for an eye is paraphrased from Hammurabi's code, which is a collection of 282 laws that are inscribed on a stone pillar. The code was found by French archaeologists in 1901 while they were excavating the city of Susa, which is in modern-day Iran.
Imagine what it would be like if we didn't have any laws, if people did just as they pleased without any regard for others. Life would probably get pretty chaotic.
The defendant in this case has been indicted by the
Law is one of society's most basic institutions and one of the most necessary. It establishes a person's rights and obligations. The law also sets penalties for those who violate these rules. Equal justice under law, reads this inscription on the Supreme Court of the United States. Although specific laws change over time, most people agree justice is one of law's guiding principles. One of the earliest known attempts to institutionalize law occurred in ancient Mesopotamia, a region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It's where Iraq is today. This ancient king, Hammurabi, ruled over Babylon from 1792 to 1750 BC. At the beginning of his reign, Mesopotamia was divided into many city-states, all with their own pattern of shifting rules. But Hammurabi eventually brought the entire region under his control. He collected laws from the various city-states and wrote down a set of codes that soon governed the entire area. Hammurabi's written code allowed law to be a matter of public knowledge and so helped advance the rule of law in society. His code dealt with issues of taxes and trade, marriage and divorce, and theft and murder. He assigned specific punishments to fit specific crimes. The Old Testament reflects Hammurabi's approach, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Hammurabi's empire eventually fell apart, but he's credited with establishing justice in the land. And the idea of codified law was just beginning. The codification movement reached its peak under the French ruler Napoleon Bonaparte. After he crowned himself emperor in 1804, Napoleon wanted to bring a new order to France. He restructured France's legal system into a new unified collection of laws known as the Napoleonic Code. A great military leader, Napoleon soon conquered most of Europe. Just as Hammurabi unified laws across Mesopotamia, Napoleon's ideas and reforms spread across Europe. He established new constitutions in the countries he conquered, and so the Napoleonic Code helped modernize an entire continent. And today, a small town in Texas attempts to bring justice to its community. They discovered here that the majority of crimes were committed by juveniles. So for first-time offenders of misdemeanors, a teen court was put into action. Here, teenagers are prosecuting, defending, and sitting on the jury. Punishment takes the form of community service. An important message is sent.
The first message is that laws are important and that they should be upheld, that young people have a role in both being law-abiding and seeing that the values of the community are enforced.
As civilization evolves, it leaves behind specific rules and laws established by past leaders and governments. What survives is the quest for law, order, and justice.
We still have examples of Hammurabi's code that exist today. So, for instance, the prologue or the introduction to the laws is very enlightening because he says that he wants to make justice visible to the land. So he's putting it on paper to make sure, or on clay, to make sure everybody knows there is a law and you're going to follow it. To destroy the wicked person and the evildoer, and that the strong might not injure the weak. So he's trying to protect the weak from the strong. And the laws themselves support compassion, and they protect things like widows and orphans, but they also talk about things like if you're having an affair, the woman gets thrown in the river and the man gets punished as well. The phrase eye for an eye represents that many people view these as harsh justice based on revenge, but the entire code is much more complex. For instance, if there's a part in there that says that if you're an engineer and you build a bad house or a bad building and the building collapses and people die, they're going to kill you. So it holds them responsible. All right, the code distinguishes among punishments for the wealthy and lower class, with the lower class unfortunately getting greater punishments than the wealthy and the commoner. All right.